Picture this. You're standing atop the most impregnable fortress in the ancient world, surrounded by walls 30 feet high and 10 feet thick, with enough food stored to last 3 years and a garrison of battle-hardened warriors ready to die for their homeland. You watch confidently as Roman legions approach your gates, thinking these invaders will break themselves against your stone defenses just like countless armies before them. But then something strange happens. Instead of charging your walls with battering rams and ladders, the Romans simply stop. They set up camp a safe distance away and begin what looks like routine construction work. You laugh at their apparent hesitancy, but 6 months later, as you're desperately rationing the last handful of grain while disease ravages your starving people, you realize with growing horror that these Romans never intended to break your walls at all. They planned something far more terrifying and effective that would make your mighty fortress nothing more than an elaborate tomb. The Roman Empire didn't conquer half the known world through luck or superior numbers alone. Behind every crimson banner and gleaming eagle standard lay a military machine so sophisticated in its siege tactics that modern warfare still studies their methods today. What made Roman sieges truly devastating wasn't their famous engineering, though their catapults and siege towers were impressive, but rather their understanding that every fortress, no matter how strong, contained the seeds of its own destruction in the form of basic human needs and psychological vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited until surrender became not just inevitable, but actually preferable to continued resistance. The invisible warfare that preceded every battle. Long before a single Roman soldier came within sight of enemy walls, the real siege had already begun through a network of spies, merchants, and collaborators who had spent months gathering intelligence about everything from water sources and food supplies to the personalities of key defenders and the loyalty of the civilian population. General Marcus Cornelius, one of Rome's most successful siege commanders, famously declared that a fortress falls in the mind before it falls in reality, and his campaigns demonstrated this philosophy through meticulous preparation that could take an entire season before the first legion even marched toward their target. Roman intelligence networks would identify every farm, granary, and supply route within 50 miles of a target fortress, creating detailed maps that showed not just geographical features but also political alignments of local tribes, seasonal harvesting patterns, and the locations of fresh water sources that defenders might use during a prolonged siege. This information gathering wasn't conducted by soldiers in armor but by ordinary-seeming traders, craftsmen, and even traveling entertainers who could move freely through enemy territory while observing defensive preparations and gauging civilian morale without arousing suspicion from guards who saw them as harmless visitors rather than advanced scouts for the approaching Roman war machine. The psychological impact of this intelligence became clear when Roman forces would arrive at a fortress already knowing the names of key defenders, the locations of hidden food stores, the schedules of guard rotations, and even personal details about the families of military commanders, information that would later prove invaluable when Romans began their campaigns of psychological warfare designed to break defender morale through targeted intimidation and offers of clemency to those willing to betray their own leaders in exchange for Roman citizenship and protection for their loved ones. Starving fortresses through strategic devastation. Once Roman legions approached their target, the first phase of siege operations focused not on the fortress walls, but on the surrounding countryside in a systematic campaign of resource denial that transformed fertile agricultural regions into barren wastelands incapable of supporting human life. Under the direction of engineering specialists like Flavius Architectus, Roman forces would fan out across hundreds of square miles, burning standing crops, destroying irrigation systems, poisoning wells with animal carcasses, and demolishing grain storage facilities while driving away livestock and forcing rural populations to flee toward the very fortress that Romans intended to starve into submission. This scorched earth strategy served multiple purposes beyond simple resource denial. The smoke from burning fields created a visible demonstration of Roman power that could be seen from fortress walls, serving as a constant psychological reminder that resistance was futile and that Rome possessed both the manpower and determination to destroy everything rather than accept defeat. Refugee populations fleeing the devastation would arrive at fortress gates carrying stories of Roman brutality, while simultaneously straining the defenders' food supplies and living space, creating overcrowded conditions that would accelerate the spread of disease and increase tensions between military personnel focused on defense and civilian populations concerned primarily with survival of their families. Roman commanders understood that hunger affected different people in different ways, with children and elderly civilians suffering first while hardened warriors could endure privation longer. So they deliberately timed their resource destruction to create maximum psychological impact when defender families began showing obvious signs of malnutrition. The sight of starving children crying behind fortress walls proved far more effective at breaking military morale than any direct assault. as soldiers found themselves torn between their duty to resist Roman occupation and their natural desire to protect their loved ones from suffering that increased with each passing day of the siege. But Romans didn't simply destroy food sources and wait for starvation to take its course. They also engaged in elaborate psychological theater designed to emphasize the contrast between Roman abundance and defender desperation. Roman camps would deliberately position their cooking fires where fortress inhabitants could smell roasting meat and baking bread, while Roman soldiers would conduct elaborate feasts within sight of enemy walls, laughing and singing while defenders watched their own rations dwindle to nothing more than watery soup made from leather and tree bark. Engineering marvels that defied gravity and logic. While starvation tactics slowly weakened fortress defenders, Roman engineering corps under masters like Quintus Mechanicus began constructing siege works that demonstrated technological capabilities so advanced that enemy populations often interpreted them as supernatural interventions by Roman gods, rather than achievements of human engineering skill and mathematical precision. These construction projects served dual purposes as both practical military installations and psychological weapons, designed to convince defenders that resistance against such technological superiority represented nothing more than prolonging inevitable defeat while increasing casualties among their own people. The most impressive of these engineering achievements were the massive siege towers called helipoles, mobile fortresses constructed from prefabricated components that could be assembled directly at siege sites to create structures rivaling the height of fortress walls themselves. These towers, often reaching heights of 90 feet or more, housed hundreds of soldiers across multiple levels connected by internal staircases and equipped with drawbridges, battering rams, catapults, and archer platforms that effectively brought Roman forces to the same elevation as enemy defenders while providing protection from arrows and stones through thick wooden walls covered with fresh animal hides that prevented incendiary attacks. Construction of these siege towers required enormous quantities of timber that Romans would harvest from local forests, often cutting down sacred groves and ancient trees that held religious significance for enemy populations as yet another form of psychological warfare designed to demonstrate that Roman power extended even over the natural world and local spiritual beliefs. The sight of massive trees being felled and shaped into components for siege engines that would soon tower over fortress walls created a sense of inevitability that gradually eroded defender confidence in their ability to withstand Roman technological capabilities. Equally impressive were the Roman siege ramps, massive earthwork constructions that could literally raise entire armies to the level of fortress walls through careful engineering and thousands of man-hours of coordinated labor. These ramps, built from stones, timber, and earth, required precise mathematical calculations to ensure proper angles and structural integrity, while incorporating defensive features that protected Roman workers from enemy attacks during the months-long construction process. The most famous example occurred during the Siege of Masada, where Romans built a ramp 375 feet high using slave labor and captured stones to create what was essentially a permanent roadway leading directly to fortress walls. Roman engineers also perfected the art of siege tunneling through specialists called sappers who could dig extensive underground networks beneath enemy fortifications, navigating by sound and smell in complete darkness while avoiding detection from defenders above. These tunnels served multiple purposes, from allowing surprise attacks behind enemy lines to undermining foundation stones that supported fortress walls, with Romans often filling completed tunnels with combustible materials that could be ignited to create controlled collapses that opened breaches in previously impregnable defenses. The deadly arsenal that rained death from above. Roman siege warfare showcased an incredible variety of specialized weapons designed for specific tactical situations, from massive stone-throwing engines that could demolish walls to precision instruments capable of picking off individual defenders with deadly accuracy. Under the supervision of artillery masters like Balisterius Maximus, Roman forces deployed an arsenal of siege engines that represented the pinnacle of ancient military technology and demonstrated engineering principles that wouldn't be surpassed until the development of gunpowder weapons centuries later. The ballista, essentially a giant crossbow mounted on a wheeled platform, could launch iron-tipped bolts with enough force to pierce multiple shields and the warriors carrying them, creating psychological terror among defenders who realized that no amount of armor or defensive positioning could protect them from Roman precision targeting. These weapons achieved remarkable accuracy at distances up to 400 yards, allowing Roman operators to pick off enemy commanders, signal bearers, and key defensive personnel while remaining safely beyond the range of return fire from fortress walls. Even more devastating were the Roman onagers, stone-throwing engines nicknamed wild donkeys, because of their characteristic recoil when fired, capable of hurling projectiles weighing up to 200 pounds with enough impact force to shatter stone walls and create devastating casualties among tightly packed defenders. These weapons could maintain sustained bombardments for hours, systematically demolishing fortress defenses while creating enormous piles of rubble that Romans would later incorporate into their assault tactics by using debris as cover for advancing troops or materials for constructing temporary fortifications closer to enemy walls. Roman artillery crews developed specialized ammunition for different tactical situations, including incendiary projectiles filled with combustible materials designed to start fires within wooden structures, fragmentation rounds that scattered deadly shrapnel across wide areas, and even primitive chemical weapons that released noxious fumes capable of driving defenders from their positions along fortress walls. Perhaps most psychologically effective were the special projectiles containing rotting animal carcasses or human remains that spread disease and created unbearable stench conditions that made normal defensive operations virtually impossible. The coordination required for effective artillery operations demonstrated Roman military sophistication, with multiple siege engines working together under centralized command to create concentrated bombardments that could overwhelm specific sections of fortress defenses. Artillery crews used complex mathematical calculations to determine proper trajectories and targeting solutions, adjusting for wind conditions, ammunition weight variations, and structural characteristics of enemy fortifications while maintaining accurate fire even during extended bombardments that could continue for days without interruption. Psychological warfare that broke minds before bodies. Roman siege tactics included sophisticated psychological operations designed to destroy defender morale through systematic campaigns of terror, misinformation, and emotional manipulation that proved often more effective than direct military assault. Under the guidance of specialists like Psychologicus Tormentum, Roman commanders employed a comprehensive understanding of human psychology to create conditions where surrender became not just militarily logical but psychologically necessary for fortress populations who found themselves unable to endure the mental stress of prolonged resistance. These psychological campaigns began with elaborate displays of Roman military might designed to convince defenders that resistance was hopeless against such overwhelming force and technological superiority. Roman legions would conduct massive parade formations within sight of fortress walls, showing off their discipline, equipment, and numbers while war horns and drums created thunderous noise that could be heard for miles. These demonstrations continued for days, with fresh units constantly rotating through the formations to create the impression that Roman forces were virtually limitless and that more reinforcements arrived daily to join the siege operations. Roman commanders also employed sophisticated disinformation campaigns designed to sow doubt and suspicion within fortress populations through carefully planted rumors about betrayal, inadequate food supplies, approaching relief forces, and the true intentions of military leadership. These rumors spread through networks of collaborators, prisoners who had been converted to the Roman cause, and even seemingly random conversations between Roman guards that were deliberately conducted within earshot of enemy scouts who would carry the information back to fortress commanders already struggling with legitimate concerns about their defensive situation. Perhaps most effective were the Roman demonstrations of what awaited fortress populations after capture, with elaborate public executions of prisoners from other conquered cities conducted within sight of defender walls, while Roman heralds announced the crimes that had earned such punishments, usually resistance to Roman authority rather than any actual criminal behavior. These spectacles were carefully choreographed to emphasize both Roman power and Roman justice, with some prisoners receiving clemency and citizenship while others faced brutal deaths that served as object lessons about the consequences of continued defiance. Roman psychological operations also targeted the families of key defenders through intelligence gathered during pre-siege reconnaissance, with Roman agents spreading stories about specific threats to named individuals and their loved ones while simultaneously offering generous terms for surrender that included protection, citizenship, and material rewards for cooperation. This personalized approach proved particularly effective against fortress commanders who found themselves torn between military duty and family obligations, especially when Romans demonstrated detailed knowledge of defender personal lives that suggested extensive intelligence networks capable of carrying out threats against civilian populations. Underground wars in complete darkness. Roman siege operations included extensive underground warfare conducted by specialist engineers called sappers who possessed unique skills in tunnel construction, underground navigation, and stealth operations that allowed them to conduct military operations beneath enemy fortifications without detection from defenders above. These underground campaigns, supervised by tunnel masters like Subterraneus Caniculus, represented some of the most dangerous and technically challenging aspects of Roman siege warfare while offering opportunities for decisive tactical advantages that could end sieges in matters of days rather than months. Roman sappers began their operations by conducting detailed geological surveys of fortress foundations to determine soil composition, drainage patterns, and structural characteristics that would influence tunnel construction techniques and strategic options for underground assault. These specialists could identify different types of earth by touch and smell, allowing them to predict soil behavior, avoid unstable ground, and select optimal routes for tunnel networks that might extend hundreds of yards beneath enemy territory while maintaining structural integrity throughout months of construction work. The tunneling process required enormous physical effort and technical expertise, with work crews operating in shifts around the clock while maintaining absolute silence to avoid detection by enemy sentries who listened constantly for sounds of underground activity. Roman tunneling equipment included specialized tools designed for quiet operation, including short-handled picks that minimized impact noise, narrow shovels that could work efficiently in confined spaces, and wooden supports that prevented tunnel collapses while allowing rapid advancement through various soil types. Roman tunnel networks often became elaborate underground cities complete with ventilation systems, supply storage areas, sleeping quarters for off-duty sappers, and command centers where operations could be coordinated without surface visibility. These installations required sophisticated engineering to ensure adequate air circulation, prevent water infiltration, and maintain structural stability while supporting the weight of earth and stone above. Some tunnel complexes included multiple levels connected by vertical shafts, allowing complex tactical operations that could emerge simultaneously at several points behind enemy lines. The tactical applications of Roman tunneling included direct assault operations where armed soldiers could emerge suddenly within fortress walls to attack defenders from behind, systematic undermining of foundation stones supporting key defensive structures, and the creation of controlled collapses that opened breaches in previously impregnable walls. Roman sappers became experts at calculating the precise amount of combustible material needed to destroy specific structural elements, often filling completed tunnels with wood, oil, and other flammable substances that could be ignited remotely to create devastating explosions beneath enemy fortifications. The living shield that never broke. Roman infantry tactics during siege operations showcased the famous testudo or turtle formation, a defensive technique that transformed individual legionaries into components of a living shield capable of advancing under heavy enemy fire while maintaining nearly impenetrable protection for soldiers working beneath its cover. This formation, perfected under tactical masters like Formatio Testudini's, required extraordinary discipline and coordination where any individual mistake could expose hundreds of soldiers to deadly enemy fire while maintaining the precision necessary for complex siege operations. The testudo formation involved intricate positioning where front-rank legionaries held their shields forward while rear ranks raised theirs overhead, creating overlapping protection that covered advancing troops from arrows, spears, and stones launched from fortress walls. Side ranks maintained shields outward to protect flanks, resulting in a mobile defensive structure so tightly coordinated that ancient sources claim soldiers could walk across the top without breaking the protective barrier. This level of precision required extensive training where legionaries practiced formation movements until they could maintain perfect alignment, even while advancing over rough terrain under combat conditions. Roman commanders used the testudo formation to protect various siege operations, including the advancement of battering rams toward fortress gates, the construction of siege works close to enemy walls, and the evacuation of wounded soldiers from exposed positions where individual movement would have been suicidal. The formation's effectiveness depended not only on shield positioning but also on timing and communication systems that allowed hundreds of soldiers to move as a single unit while responding instantly to commands from formation leaders who monitored enemy activity and adjusted tactics accordingly. The psychological impact of the testudo formation proved as important as its defensive capabilities, with enemy defenders often reporting feelings of hopelessness when watching Roman formations advance steadily despite continuous bombardment that would have scattered any normal military unit. The sight of arrows and stones bouncing harmlessly off Roman shields while legionaries continued their methodical advance created an impression of supernatural invincibility that gradually eroded defender confidence in their ability to stop Roman assault operations through conventional defensive tactics. Roman variations of the testudo included specialized formations for specific siege situations, such as the siege turtle, designed specifically for battering ram operations, the climbing turtle, adapted for scaling operations against fortress walls, and the engineering turtle, configured to protect construction crews working on siege engines or defensive structures under enemy fire. Each variation required specialized training and equipment modifications while maintaining the basic principles of coordinated shield work that made the formation effective against various types of enemy resistance. The infrastructure of total domination. Roman siege operations included the construction of elaborate infrastructure around targeted fortresses that created self-sufficient military cities capable of supporting thousands of soldiers for extended periods while maintaining complete control over surrounding territory. Under the supervision of engineering commanders like Castrameter Supremus, Roman forces built these temporary installations with the same attention to detail and defensive planning that characterized permanent military bases. demonstrating organizational capabilities that impressed even their enemies with the scale and sophistication of Roman logistical operations. Roman siege camps followed standardized layouts based on centuries of military experience, with each installation including organized streets, supply depots, weapons storage facilities, medical stations, command centers, workshops for equipment maintenance, and even recreational areas where off-duty soldiers could rest and maintain morale during extended siege operations. These camps were surrounded by defensive fortifications including ditches, earthwork ramparts, and wooden palisades that could withstand attacks from enemy relief forces while providing secure bases for Roman siege operations. The famous Roman double wall system, consisting of circumvallation facing inward to contain enemy sorties and contravallation facing outward to prevent relief operations, created impenetrable barriers that completely isolated targeted fortresses while establishing Roman control over vast areas of surrounding territory. Construction of these defensive lines required enormous quantities of materials and thousands of man-hours of coordinated labor, with Roman forces often dismantling local buildings, harvesting timber from extensive forest areas, and quarrying stone from nearby sources to create fortifications that rivaled permanent military installations. Roman supply operations during extended sieges demonstrated logistical capabilities that supported large armies far from their home territories through organized delivery systems that could transport food, water, weapons, construction materials, and replacement personnel across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory. These supply chains included permanent road improvements, bridge construction projects, warehouse facilities, and security forces that ensured reliable delivery schedules even during adverse weather conditions or enemy harassment operations. Roman siege infrastructure also included specialized facilities for siege engine construction, ammunition production, equipment repair, and prisoner processing that allowed Roman forces to maintain and expand their military capabilities throughout extended siege operations. These installations often became permanent Roman settlements after successful siege conclusions, with temporary military camps evolving into civilian cities that extended Roman culture and administration into newly conquered territories. Breaking points where stone hearts cracked. The culmination of Roman siege tactics came when defenders finally reached psychological and physical breaking points where continued resistance became impossible despite their original determination to fight to the death for their homeland and families. These moments, carefully orchestrated by Roman commanders like Fracturus Voluntatus, represented the successful integration of all Roman siege techniques: starvation, disease, psychological warfare, technological superiority, and relentless pressure, into a comprehensive assault on every aspect of defender capability and willpower that made surrender not just inevitable but actually preferable to continued suffering. Roman commanders could recognize the approaching collapse of enemy resistance through systematic observation of defender behavior, including reduced activity along fortress walls, decreased accuracy of enemy fire, longer intervals between defensive sorties, and visible signs of internal discord among fortress populations. Roman intelligence networks provided detailed reports about food shortages, disease outbreaks, civilian unrest, and leadership disputes that indicated growing instability within enemy ranks, while Roman psychological operations intensified their campaigns of disinformation and terror designed to accelerate the final breakdown of organized resistance. The actual surrender process often began with unofficial communications between Roman commanders and fortress leaders through intermediaries, such as captured soldiers who had been treated well, local civilians who had maintained contact with both sides, or religious figures who could negotiate terms without appearing to betray either party. These preliminary discussions allowed both sides to explore possible surrender terms, while maintaining the fiction that fortress defenders were still committed to continued resistance, providing face-saving opportunities that made final capitulation psychologically acceptable to military leaders who had sworn oaths to defend their positions to the death. Roman surrender terms typically included generous provisions for fortress populations who had fought bravely, with soldiers often receiving opportunities to join Roman legions while civilians gained Roman citizenship and protection, along with compensation for property losses incurred during siege operations. These policies reflected Roman understanding that merciful treatment of defeated enemies encouraged future surrenders, while harsh retribution inspired desperate resistance that increased Roman casualties and delayed conquest operations. However, Roman mercy was conditional upon timely surrender, with commanders making clear that continued resistance after reasonable surrender terms had been offered would result in far harsher treatment, including slavery, execution of military leaders, and complete destruction of fortress installations. This policy created powerful incentives for early surrender while demonstrating that Roman patience had limits that should not be tested by enemy populations hoping for miraculous relief or divine intervention. The legacy of calculated brutality and brilliant strategy. Roman siege warfare represented the pinnacle of ancient military science through its integration of engineering excellence, psychological sophistication, logistical mastery, and strategic thinking that created a military system capable of reducing any fortification regardless of its apparent strength or the determination of its defenders. Under legendary commanders like Obsidio Invictus, Roman siege operations demonstrated principles of combined arms coordination, systematic planning, and adaptive tactics that influenced military thinking for centuries while establishing Roman dominion over territories spanning 3 continents. The effectiveness of Roman siege tactics stemmed from their comprehensive approach that attacked not just fortress walls but every aspect of defender capability, including food supplies, water sources, morale, internal unity, hope for relief, and confidence in ultimate victory. Roman commanders understood that successful siege operations required patience, resources, technical expertise, and psychological insight combined with the willingness to employ any methods necessary to achieve their strategic objectives, regardless of moral considerations that might limit other military forces. Roman siege techniques evolved continuously through practical experience gained during hundreds of successful operations against diverse enemy fortifications, with Roman military engineers constantly developing new weapons, tactics, and strategies based on lessons learned from both victories and occasional setbacks. This culture of innovation and adaptation allowed Roman siege capabilities to remain superior to defensive technologies throughout the imperial period, ensuring that no enemy fortress could long resist Roman determination to expand their territorial control. The psychological impact of Roman siege successes extended far beyond individual conquered cities to influence the behavior of potential enemies who often chose submission over resistance after witnessing the fate of those who had challenged Roman military capabilities. Stories of Roman siege methods spread throughout the ancient world, creating a reputation for invincibility that often achieved Roman strategic objectives without requiring actual military operations, as enemy populations chose peaceful surrender over certain destruction. Modern military historians continue to study Roman siege warfare as examples of strategic thinking, tactical innovation, and operational planning that demonstrate timeless principles of combined arms coordination, logistical support, psychological operations, and adaptive leadership that remain relevant for contemporary military operations despite the technological advances that have transformed the tools and techniques of warfare since ancient times. The sweet victory that always came. The ultimate irony of Roman siege warfare was that their most impressive victories often concluded not with dramatic assaults and heroic last stands, but with quiet surrenders by exhausted defenders who had finally recognized that continued resistance served no purpose except prolonging the suffering of their loved ones while Roman patience and resources remained virtually unlimited. These anticlimactic endings, orchestrated by diplomatic specialists like Pax Negotiator, represented the true genius of Roman siege tactics that achieved complete victory through systematic pressure rather than costly frontal assaults that would have resulted in heavy casualties for both sides. Roman post-siege policies demonstrated strategic wisdom that transformed defeated enemies into loyal allies through generous treatment that exceeded the expectations of fortress populations who had anticipated harsh retribution for their resistance. Roman administrators worked quickly to restore normal civilian life, rebuild damaged infrastructure, establish trade relationships, and integrate local populations into Roman cultural and economic systems that provided tangible benefits including security, prosperity, and citizenship opportunities that made Roman rule preferable to their previous independence. The systematic nature of Roman siege victories created a template for successful military operations that emphasized preparation, patience, technological superiority, and psychological understanding over brute force approaches that might achieve short-term tactical success while creating long-term strategic problems. Roman siege methods demonstrated that the most effective military strategies often achieved their objectives through indirect approaches that attacked enemy weaknesses rather than direct assaults against enemy strengths, principles that remain valid for military operations regardless of technological changes. Roman siege warfare ultimately succeeded because it combined military excellence with political wisdom, using force as a tool for achieving strategic objectives rather than an end in itself, while demonstrating that true victory required not just defeating enemy armies but convincing enemy populations that Roman rule offered better prospects than continued resistance. This integration of military and political considerations created a sustainable model for imperial expansion that allowed Roman civilization to endure for centuries while lesser empires collapsed under the weight of their military conquests. The genius of Roman siege tactics lay not in any single innovation or technique, but in their systematic integration of every available resource, human, technological, psychological, and environmental, into coordinated campaigns that made victory inevitable regardless of initial enemy advantages in defensive position, numerical strength, or fighting determination. This comprehensive approach to warfare demonstrated that success in military operations depended more on superior planning, organization, and execution than on individual heroism or technological superiority alone. lessons that continue to influence military thinking in the modern era where information, logistics, and psychological operations play increasingly important roles in determining the outcomes of armed conflicts. And so the mighty Roman war machine rolled forward across continents, leaving behind not just conquered territories, but also the enduring legacy of military science that proved definitively that even the strongest walls must eventually fall when confronted by the systematic application of human intelligence, technological innovation, and unwavering determination guided by strategic vision that understood victory as the inevitable result of superior preparation rather than fortunate accident or divine intervention.